This is in Stafford County, Virginia. And remember that Virginia, as one of the original colonies, is what we consider a meets and bounds state. They don't have the public land survey system like we have here in the Northwest Territories. So land boundaries tend to be a bit more chaotic appearing, and I don't mean chaos in that it was out of control, but lines of ownership are affected perhaps more directly by topographic features. There are a few things I want to point out about this particular plat. One of the striking things about this plat is the number of lines on here that are not necessarily boundaries. For instance, if I take a look here in lots 18 and 20, there are several types of land use indicated. Certainly the overall lot boundaries are indicated in heavy black lines. Let's look at some of the easements and areas, special areas designated. Over here we have some kind of easement that appears to be 250 feet wide, and that is spelled out in County Recorder of Deeds office in Deed Book 535 on page 285. In that legal document, more complete description and the legal status of this easement can be found. Here's another easement up here. We have a 60-foot slope grading and storm drainage easement that runs along the front of these lots parallel to the highway. Notice over here it bumps out to about 85 feet. This even goes so far as to tell you how far along the arc from this lot line to this corner that is. Here you have another 30-foot storm drainage easement, and you can see the end of it located, and then the center line of it listed with a bearing and a distance. So 30 feet would indicate 15 feet centered on either side of this center line. Here we have a conservation easement. The 100-year floodplain is indicated in here. Notice the floodplain limit. We aren't necessarily making any claims to the exact location. Why? Well, it's a pretty good approximation. Whereas here for this conservation easement, we have several lines that have been spelled out. What's common is these straight lines are listed in a table. So line 60 will have a bearing and distance. Line 59 will have a bearing and distance, and so forth, 58, 57, 56, and so forth. We have several overlapping land uses. The owner that holds Lot 20 holds the entire area. However, the easements indicate that land inside those areas can be used by others for specific purposes. The folks that maintain Revel Road here, which is a public road, if they need to do grading work or storm drainage work in this 60-foot area, have every right to do so because they hold the easement. The floodplain indicates an area that would be unsuitable for certain types of improvements, such as buildings. Further indicating that is a note here that says we have a wetland area. So it's important that features that show land use restrictions and opportunities be indicated on plats like this. But recall, an easement grants someone access to the land, even though they don't own it. They have access to the land for specific purposes. This one is right here in Champaign County. In fact, several of you may have driven past this already. Legal description shows directly on this plat, and this survey falls in part of the south half of the northwest quarter of Section 5, Township 19 North, Range 9 East. Tract 1 is the north 30 rods of the south half of the northwest quarter of said Section 5, lying east of the middle line of the Saline ditch. We don't necessarily have an indication right here of how old that legal description is, but I think you can understand where the center line of the saline ditch is can change. Now, this is a man-made ditch, so it's not going to be wandering like a natural stream does, but through dredging or differences in measurement, perhaps the center line of that ditch is open to interpretation or change over time. But what's common practice these days is to actually show on a plat where that is. Now understand, the legal description is this. However, the plat can be used to supplement that information. Well, the line of the saline ditch here in Tract 1 is not necessarily a straight line. So what has been done is the surveyor in the field went out and located a good approximation of the center line of that ditch and has shown it on the plat here. We have a distance from the northeast corner of that tract over to the intersection of the north line of the tract and the center line of the ditch. Here you can even see a line that's labeled top. That is the top of the slope was measured. So we have a little topographic information here to supplement the evidence that we have for the ditch. You can see a bend point in this. Now, would we monument that? Well, no. It falls out in the middle of the creek. However, in some cases, we might have a witness corner on the bank. There is something worth noting down here on the southeast corner of this plat. It says, see detail A, we found a witness corner recovered. It was a 1-inch pipe bent, and it falls 7.5 feet north and 21.6 feet east. Well, let's also see detail A here. Let's jump in a little closer. We've got the north right-of-way line of I-74, and we have some kind of marker here found. We'll have to look at the legend to see what that symbol means. But 50 feet over from the center line of the saline ditch falls this corner. And then this particular symbol here indicates a right-of-way marker. You've seen them along the highway. It's a square concrete post, usually 4 inches square with a peak top. And here we're simply saying this line falls 1/1400ths south of the north face of this, and the corner that we're looking for falls 4.7 feet west of the right-of-way marker. But other indications say that the survey crew found a bent pipe that may have been somebody's interpretation of the boundary, and we don't know. But we're simply showing it that it's 7.5 feet north and 21.6 feet east. Rather than ignore it, we are calling it out and saying, yes, this may be evidence of the boundary. However, we're not necessarily going to call it a corner. We're simply going to call it a witness to the corner. And that seems to indicate that crew set a 1/2-inch diameter by 30-inch long rebar with aluminum cap stamped Wesley J. Myers, IPLS number 2803. Okay. Here you can see the right-of-way marker symbol, and then some kind of other survey monument, recovered survey monument as described. Another one that I want to call to your attention is it has a lot of good stuff in it, worth noting. It has a fairly good-sized plat, and the client here was, I believe, Clifford Jacobs Foundry. This particular type of survey is known as an Alta Survey. Alta stands for American Land Title Association, and an Alta and ACSM land title survey is often done at the request of some lending institution that is financing purchase or refinancing of some commercial property. Alta was American Land Title Association. ACSM is the American Congress on Surveying and Mapping. Alta and ACSM joined forces several years ago to establish a set of joint standards for what this kind of survey would include. in this area, not only are you seeing all kinds of lines and utilities and buildings, but you're seeing this thing, this is VAC Street. And that is a vacated street. What's that mean? This area was originally shown on a plat as an intended public street. Perhaps there was actually pavement there at some point, either at the request of the client or perhaps by acquiescence of the city. This particular land that was occupied by the street that was public land was vacated to the adjoining landowners. Now, in this case, if the adjoiner was the owners of what you see, this Lot A and Tract 11, then it probably came under common ownership. In fact, you can see with the heavy boundary here, it is certainly now owned by the client. Although streets were public land, the land for the street was originally in the public. Now it is no longer under public ownership. Next to the Clifford Jacobs Foundry is an area that is part of the Wilbur Heights subdivision. This Wilbur Heights subdivision can be found in Plat Book E on page 326. This is in the recorder's office, the county recorder's office. You could find a plat that shows all the dimensions of these lots. Now notice these lots are 25 feet wide and 132 foot deep. That was the original intent. These were narrow little lots, and very commonly in a situation like this, you'll have one house, one residence may occupy 2 or 3 or 4 more lots. In fact, here in this case, the client owns multiple lots. Not only do they own multiple lots, but it appears that part of what was a public alley that shows as 20 feet wide may have been vacated. Here for, I believe, what is the soffit on this building, it's been determined that there's about a 4/10 of a foot clearance. Well, that's significant. If that was overhanging the boundary line, there could be some consequences. Notice here we've got an old mobile home, the end of which appears to fall out in the right-of-way of Paul Avenue. In this block of the Wilbur Heights subdivision, in order to accomplish the survey crew had to go out and do a thorough search for boundary corners. In this case, the circle with a dot in the middle indicates what the survey crew set after all the boundary analysis and computations were resolved. They set the corners of this tract. They found only this point, and this point. Well, so you might be thinking, wow, how did they figure all that out? Well, there has to be other monumentation searched for in a lot of other places. For instance, this point here and this point here become very significant. This point here becomes very significant for geometrically reestablishing not only the directions, but the lengths of all these lines. Further, we have to take a look at the location of the pavement, because the pavement is intended to be centered in the right-of-way. Well, if we have a center line joint down the pavement, then that gives us some indication of where the right-of-way line is supposed to be. So we have to collect lots and lots of information, because many times our reality looks like this: a whole subdivision and lots of fences and driveways and houses everywhere, but are there very many markers left in the ground? Many times, very, very few. Okay, you've been looking at these Boulder Ridge plans. Our point of beginning is east of a point of commencement. This point of commencement is the southwest corner of Section 4. This particular brass plate falls out in the intersection of Staley Road and Bradley Avenue, and we proceed 1,866 feet down the south line of that section and then north along the right-of-way of Bluegrass Lane to this point of beginning. And then you can trace all the way around the boundary of this subdivision. And the boundary has a meets and bounds description that contains all of these directions and distances from the point of beginning back to the point of beginning. That legal description shows up here on the second sheet. Fortunately, for people purchasing lots in this subdivision, they're not going to have this great big long legal description. If you were to purchase lot 228A, your legal description would simply be lot 228 of Boulder Ridge Second Subdivision, in addition to the city of Champaign, Champaign County, Illinois, a part of the southwest quarter and southeast quarter of Section 4, Township 19 North, Range 8 East of the Third Principal Meridian. End of story. The purpose of the subdivision plat like this is certainly not only to divide the land with a legal document into smaller lots, but also to simplify documentation later on. Let's wrap up with our discussion of the waterfall model. As we harken back to the Homer survey I talked about earlier, we did the boundary work, we did the data collection work, we did boundary computations, and had to determine just exactly mathematically where those lines fell. Drafting was the next phase. You saw that in the plats that we created. And then here we indicate that there is some review that is necessary. We need to review that plat in the field to ensure all the features have been properly collected and drafted. Review the plat against the checklist to ensure it meets company and state standards. What checklist is that? Well, for instance, it may have been the Alta ACSM land title survey standards. It may be the minimum state statutes governing land survey. And, of course, the customer, our client, is going to have some input on this because really the intent of the plat is to convey the seller's intention. Signatures make it a legal document, and of course, once it's conveyed, once that document is in the customer's hands, then our contract is complete. But this process is not only linear like this, it can loop back on itself. You may go through several iterations of reconnaissance, control, data collection, boundary and geometry, drafting and review. You may do this multiple times depending on the complexity of the project. Little things like notes on a plat like this may seem obscure to you. You might wonder, why is there a note that says the subdivision is located within the Unit 4 school district? Well, once you find out that that is a legally required clause specified by the subdivision ordinance in that municipality, then you start to see how everything on a document like this has a very clear purpose. So, when in doubt, ask. As young engineers, you will earn the trust and the respect of the people you work with by asking and being someone who is willing to learn. Take advantage of the expertise of the people that have gone before you, and then you will have a bright and rewarding career. Thanks for your time today.